The Montana sun beat down mercilessly on the stagecoach as it rattled along the dusty trail toward Dead Horse Gulch. Inside, Clara Whitmore pressed a lace handkerchief to her temple, trying in vain to maintain some semblance of the composure expected of a Boston lady. The red dust of the frontier had already claimed her traveling dress, turning the fine blue silk a muddy brown. "Nearly there, Miss Whitmore." The driver called down. "Another hour, maybe 2 if the horses tire." Clara nodded, though he couldn't see her. She'd been traveling for weeks now, each mile taking her further from everything she'd known and closer to a future she hadn't chosen. The letter from her father still lay folded in her reticule, its contents burned into her memory. The arrangement with Mr. Bartholomew Rusk is our family's salvation. You will find him a gentleman of considerable means and influence. The wedding shall take place upon your arrival in Montana. Salvation. Clara almost laughed at the word. Selling their only daughter to a railroad magnate hardly seemed like salvation to her. But the Whitmore fortune had dwindled to nothing but debts and mortgaged properties. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. The stagecoach lurched suddenly, throwing Clara against the window. Outside, she heard the driver curse and the horses whinny in alarm. Then came the sound she'd been warned about but hoped never to hear, the thunder of hooves and the crack of gunfire. "Bandits!" the driver shouted. "Everyone down!" Clara's heart hammered as she dropped to the floor of the coach. Through the window, she could see masked riders circling them like wolves. The elderly couple sharing her coach huddled together, the woman sobbing quietly into her husband's shoulder. The shooting intensified. Clara heard the driver cry out, then the sickening thud of a body hitting the ground. The horses, now driverless, veered off the trail in panic. The coach tilted dangerously, and Clara knew they were moments from overturning. Then, through the chaos, came a different sound. A lone rifle, its report deeper and more measured than the bandits' weapons. Clara dared to peek through the window and saw him, a solitary figure on horseback, emerging from a cluster of sagebrush like a spirit of the desert itself. The man was covered in red dust from head to toe, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. He rode with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle, his rifle finding its mark with deadly precision. One bandit fell, then another. The remaining outlaws, suddenly finding themselves outgunned, wheeled their horses and fled into the Badlands. The coach finally came to a stop, tilted at an angle but miraculously upright. Clara climbed out on shaking legs, helping the elderly couple behind her. The dusty rider had dismounted and was checking on the fallen driver. He shook his head once. The man was beyond help. "Thank you," Clara said, approaching their savior. "We owe you our lives." The man turned to her, and Clara felt her breath catch. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and haunting against his sun-weathered face. There was something in those eyes, a weight, a sorrow that seemed infinite. He looked at her for a long moment, then simply touched the brim of his hat and turned away. "Wait," Clara called. "What's your name? How can we repay you?" But he was already mounting his horse. Without a word, without looking back, he rode off into the heat shimmer of the desert, leaving Clara standing in the dust with the strangest feeling that she'd just glimpsed her destiny. The elderly man, Mr. Garrett, knew enough about horses to get them back on the trail. They wrapped the driver's body in a blanket and continued toward Dead Horse Gulch, arriving as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The town appeared suddenly out of the desert like a mirage. A collection of wooden buildings huddled along a single main street, defiant against the vastness of the Montana territory. Clara had expected rustic conditions, but nothing had prepared her for the raw frontier reality of Dead Horse Gulch. The air was thick with dust and the smell of horses, tinged with smoke from the saloons and the acrid scent of the mining operations in the nearby hills. Men in worn clothing eyed the stagecoach with curiosity, and Clara felt acutely aware of her eastern finery, tattered as it now was. The Grand Hotel, despite its name, was a modest 2-story building with a false front that made it appear grander than it was. Clara secured a room and tried to wash away the dust of her journey, but it seemed to have settled into her very soul. The next morning, she ventured out to send word of her arrival to Bartholomew Rusk. The telegraph office was at the far end of the street, and Clara walked quickly, keeping her eyes forward despite the stares and whispers that followed her. Halfway there, she stopped dead in her tracks. In the alley beside the Dusty Rose Saloon, a man was working in the stable, his back to the street. Even from behind, she knew him instantly, the set of his shoulders, the way he moved with that same easy grace she'd witnessed yesterday, the mysterious rider who had saved them. Clara found herself walking toward him before she'd made a conscious decision to do so. He was mucking out stalls, the least glamorous of jobs, his clothes even more dust-covered than they'd been on the trail. As she approached, he turned, and those pale eyes found hers again. Recognition flickered across his features, followed by something that might have been dismay. He looked away, continuing his work as if she weren't there. "You saved our lives yesterday," Clara said softly. "I wanted to thank you properly." He paused in his work, but didn't turn around. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of the town waking up, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the creak of wagon wheels, the low murmur of voices. "Do you work here?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. A single nod was her only response. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I've just arrived from Boston." She waited, but no introduction came in return. "Won't you at least tell me your name?" He finally turned to face her fully. Up close, she could see the lines etched by sun and hardship around his eyes, the firm set of his jaw beneath several days' worth of stubble. He studied her for a moment, then shook his head slowly and deliberately. It was then she understood. He couldn't speak, whether by choice or circumstance. This man who had appeared like an avenging angel on the trail was bound by silence. "I see," Clara said gently. "Well then, I shall simply have to call you my guardian angel." For the first time, something shifted in those winter sky eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a flicker of warmth quickly suppressed. He touched his hat brim again, that same gesture of acknowledgement from the trail, and returned to his work. Clara stood there a moment longer, unwilling to break this strange connection. There was something about him that called to her, something beyond gratitude for her rescue. It was as if the desert wind had blown away all pretense, leaving only this raw, inexplicable pull between them. "Miss Whitmore," a sharp voice cut through the morning air. "What in heaven's name are you doing in this establishment?" Clara turned to see a well-dressed woman bearing down on her, disapproval etched in every line of her face. "I'm Mrs. Prudence Weatherby," the woman announced. "Mr. Rusk sent word that his fiancée would be arriving, and here I find you consorting with stable hands. Come away at once." "This is no place for a lady." Clara glanced back at the silent cowboy, but he had already disappeared into the shadows of the stable. With reluctance, she allowed Mrs. Weatherby to lead her away, but not before catching one last glimpse of those pale eyes watching her from the darkness. As she walked back toward the respectable part of town, Clara realized that Dead Horse Gulch had already changed her in some fundamental way. The dust of the frontier had indeed settled into her soul, and with it came the first stirrings of a wildness she'd never known existed within her, a wildness that answered to those haunted eyes and the mystery of a man who saved lives but wouldn't speak his own name. The weeks that followed Clara's arrival in Dead Horse Gulch passed in a blur of social calls and preparations for a wedding she dreaded more with each passing day. Mrs. Weatherby had taken it upon herself to be Clara's chaperone and instructor in what she called frontier propriety, which seemed to consist mainly of avoiding anyone who actually worked for a living. "You must understand, my dear," Mrs. Weatherby explained over tea in her stuffy parlor. "Maintaining civilized standards is what separates us from the rabble. Why, when I first arrived here 15 years ago, this place was nothing but tents and wickedness. We've worked hard to bring respectability to Dead Horse Gulch. Clara nodded politely, though she found the woman's definition of respectability stifling. Through the lace curtains, she could see the real life of the town. Cowboys driving cattle down the main street, miners heading to the saloons after long shifts, women in calico dresses bargaining at the general store. It was raw and honest in a way that misses Weatherby's parlor, with its imported wallpaper and delicate china, could never be. Mr. Rusk will be arriving tomorrow. Mrs. Weatherby continued. He's been overseeing the railroad expansion near Billings. Such an important man. You're very fortunate, my dear. Very fortunate indeed. That evening, Clara escaped the confines of her hotel room and walked to the edge of town. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. She'd discovered this spot in her first week, a small rise that overlooked both the town and the vast expanse beyond. It had become her refuge when the walls of civilization pressed too close. She wasn't surprised to find she wasn't alone. The silent cowboy sat on a boulder, his back to her, watching the sunset. In the weeks since their first encounter, she'd learned that the townspeople called him simply Nameless. No one knew where he'd come from or why he wouldn't speak. He worked odd jobs around town, slept in a lean-to outside the settlement, and kept to himself. Clara approached quietly and sat on a nearby rock. He glanced at her, and she thought she saw something like resignation in his eyes, as if he'd been expecting her intrusion into his solitude. They sat in companionable silence as the sun sank lower. Clara had discovered that words weren't necessary between them. There was something peaceful about his presence, something that quieted the constant anxiety about her future. He arrives tomorrow, she said finally. Bartholomew Rusk, my fiancé. The word tasted bitter on her tongue. Nameless turned to look at her fully. The setting sun caught his eyes, turning them from pale blue to amber. There was a question there, unspoken but clear. I've never met him, Clara admitted. The arrangement was made entirely between him and my father. I'm told he's... She paused, trying to remember the words from her father's letters. A man of vision and ambition, a builder of empires. A shadow crossed Nameless's face. He picked up a small stone and threw it toward the horizon with perhaps more force than necessary. You know him? Clara asked. Surprised. He nodded once, curtly, and she saw his jaw tighten. His hand moved unconsciously to his side, where Clara noticed for the first time the butt of an old army revolver, worn smooth with use. Is he... she began, then stopped. What was she asking? Is he cruel? Is he kind? Will he make me happy? The question seemed childish in the face of her obligation. Nameless stood abruptly and walked a few paces away. When he turned back, he pointed to the town below, then swept his arm toward the open desert. The meaning was clear. You belong out there, not down here. I don't have a choice. Clara whispered. He studied her for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He pulled a small object from his pocket and placed it in her palm, a piece of turquoise, worn smooth, the color of his eyes. Before she could respond, he was gone, walking back toward town with that easy stride that spoke of a lifetime of departures. The next morning, Dead Horse Gulch transformed. Bartholomew Rusk's arrival was an event. His private railway car pulled onto the siding that served the town, and half the population turned out to witness it. Clara stood with Mrs. Weatherby at the small depot, wearing her best remaining dress, the turquoise hidden in her glove. Rusk emerged from his car like a king surveying his domain. He was not what Clara had expected, handsome in a sharp, calculated way, with steel-gray eyes and prematurely silver hair that gave him a distinguished air. His suit was immaculate despite the journey, every button polished, every crease precise. Miss Whitmore, he said, taking her hand and bowing over it. His grip was firm, possessive. At last we meet. Your father spoke highly of your beauty, but I see he was modest in his descriptions. Mr. Rusk, Clara managed. Welcome to Dead Horse Gulch, he laughed, a sound without warmth. Not for long. My dear, once we're married, We'll be living in Helena. I've purchased a mansion there, fitting for a woman of your standing. This place," he gestured dismissively at the town, "is merely a temporary necessity. Progress demands sacrifice." Over the following days, Clara came to understand what kind of man her father had sold her to. Rusk was intelligent, charming when it suited him, and utterly ruthless. She accompanied him on his business calls and watched him manipulate, threaten, and coerce local landowners into selling their property for the railroad expansion. "You see, Clara," he explained after a particularly brutal negotiation with an elderly rancher, "these people don't understand vision. They cling to their little plots of dirt while I'm building the future. Sometimes one must be firm." "Firm?" Clara echoed, thinking of the tears in the old rancher's eyes as he signed away his family's homestead. "It's for their own good," Rusk said, patting her hand condescendingly. "They'll thank me when the railroad brings prosperity. Those who resist progress get left behind, or worse." That evening, there was a celebration at the Cattlemen's Association, a chance for Rusk to court the local elite. Clara found herself displayed like a trophy, smiled at and spoken about rather than to. The turquoise in her pocket seemed to burn against her palm. Halfway through the evening, a commotion arose near the entrance. Clara looked up to see Nameless being roughly escorted out by two of Rusk's men. His shirt was torn, and there was blood on his lip. "What's happening?" Clara demanded, moving toward them. "Nothing to concern yourself with, my dear," Rusk said, catching her arm. "The man was caught stealing. My men are simply maintaining order." But Clara had seen Nameless's eyes as he was dragged past. There was no guilt there, only a cold fury directed at Rusk. She pulled free of Rusk's grip. "He's no thief." Rusk's expression darkened for just a moment before the charming mask slipped back into place. "You know this person? He saved my life on the trail. He's an honest man." "An honest man who can't even speak his own name?" Rusk laughed. "Really, Clara, you must be more discerning about the company you keep. Your soft heart does you credit, but these frontier types will take advantage of such kindness." Clara wanted to argue, but Mrs. Weatherby appeared at her elbow, guiding her back to the party with iron determination. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow congratulations on her upcoming nuptials. Late that night, Clara slipped out of the hotel and made her way to the edge of town. She found Nameless's lean-to by following the thin stream of smoke from his small fire. He sat beside it, cleaning the cut on his lip with a wet cloth. "I'm sorry," she said, emerging from the darkness. "I know you didn't steal anything." He looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a protective concern that made her heart race. He shook his head and gestured for her to go back. "I can't," she said, sitting down across the fire from him. "I can't go back to that room, to that life, to that man. Not tonight." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Nameless reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. He hesitated, then handed it to her. Inside was a medal, tarnished and broken, a medal of honor from the war. Below it, a faded photograph of a woman and child, their faces worn away by years of handling. Clara understood. Here was his story, or part of it, loss, service, and something that had broken him so completely he'd given up his very name. She handed the items back gently, her fingers brushing his. "We all carry our wounds," she said softly. He looked at her then with such intensity that she felt exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. His hand moved slightly, as if he might reach for her, then fell back to his side. A coyote howled in the distance, reminding Clara of the lateness of the hour. She stood reluctantly. "Rusk is not what he seems," she said. "I see that now, but I have no choice. My family." Nameless stood too, and for a moment they were close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He smelled of leather and smoke and something wild that made her think of freedom. His hand came up slowly, hesitantly, and touched her cheek, the lightest brush of work-roughened fingers. Then he stepped back and pointed to the horizon again. more urgently this time. "Run," his eyes seemed to say, "while you still can." Clara fled back to town, her cheek burning where he'd touched her, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her like the endless Montana sky. The morning brought news that shook Dead Horse Gulch to its foundations. The Hendricks family, who owned a small ranch along the proposed railroad route, had been burned out in the night. Their barn was ashes, their cattle scattered or dead. And old Tom Hendricks was nursing a broken arm it claimed came from falling while trying to fight the fire. Clara heard about it at breakfast in the hotel dining room, where the talk was of nothing else. "Terrible accident, Mrs. Weatherby said, though her eyes darted nervously as she spoke. "Tom Hendricks always was careless with his lanterns." "Weren't no accident," growled Jake Morrison from the next table. He was a teamster who'd lived in Dead Horse Gulch for 20 years. "Tom Hendricks never smoked a day in his life, and he's careful as a church mouse with fire. This was done deliberate." "You'd best watch your tongue, Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Weatherby warned. "Spreading baseless rumors helps no one." But Clara had seen Rusk's face when he'd heard the news. There had been no surprise there, only satisfaction quickly hidden. She excused herself and went to find the doctor who was treating Tom Hendricks. The old rancher lay in the back room of Doc Holcomb's office, his weathered face pale against the white sheets. His wife, Martha, sat beside him, holding his uninjured hand. "Miss Whitmore," Martha said, surprise evident in her voice. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to see how you were faring," Clara said, pulling up a chair. "And to ask, what really happened last night?" Tom and Martha exchanged glances. "You're marrying Rusk," Tom said finally. "Why would you care what happened to folks like us?" "Because I have eyes and a conscience," Clara replied. "Please, tell me the truth." Martha's composure broke. "4 men came just after midnight, masked, but we knew one of them by his voice, Bill Garrett, who works for the railroad. They said we had one last chance to sell. Tom refused, and they—" She gestured helplessly at her husband's injuries. "They made sure I watched while they burned the barn," Tom added bitterly. "Said next time it'd be the house, with us in it." Clara felt sick. "We have to tell the sheriff." "Sheriff Brady's in Rusk's pocket," Tom interrupted. "Half the town is, the other half's too scared to speak up. That's how it is. Miss Whitmore, your fiancé owns this town, and soon he'll own everything around it too." Clara left the doctor's office in turmoil. As she walked back toward the hotel, she saw Rusk himself striding down the boardwalk, flanked by his men. He smiled when he saw her, that cold smile that never reached his eyes. "Clara, my dear, I was just coming to find you. I have a surprise." He took her arm possessively. "I've arranged for us to take a ride this afternoon. I want to show you the future I'm building." Unable to refuse without causing a scene, Clara found herself in Rusk's private carriage an hour later, traveling out of town along the proposed railroad route. Rusk talked the entire way, painting grand pictures of progress and prosperity. "You see that valley?" he said, pointing to a stretch of pristine grassland where pronghorn antelope grazed. "By next year, there will be a depot there. The year after, a town. I'm not just building a railroad. Clara, I'm building an empire." "And the people who already live here?" Clara asked. "The ranchers, the homesteaders?" Rusk waved dismissively. "They'll adapt or move on. Progress waits for no one." He turned to her, taking her hands in his. "You'll be at my side through it all, the queen of my empire." Clara pulled her hands away. "I saw the Hendricks family this morning." His expression didn't change. "Tragic. Fire is such a danger in these dry conditions." "It wasn't an accident." Now his eyes hardened. "Be very careful about repeating unfounded gossip, my dear. It's unbecoming of a lady of your station." They were passing through a narrow canyon when the carriage suddenly lurched to a stop. The horses whinnied nervously, and Clara heard the driver curse. Looking out, she saw why. A lone rider blocked their path. Nameless sat his horse calmly in the middle of the trail. his rifle resting across his saddle. His eyes were fixed on Rusk with an intensity that made Clara shiver. "Move aside! You saddle tramp!" the driver shouted. Nameless didn't budge. Rusk's men reached for their weapons, but Rusk raised a hand to stop them. "I know you," he said, studying Nameless with new interest. "Fort Laramie, wasn't it? Or was it Sand Creek?" A cruel smile played at his lips. "Oh, I remember now. You were with Major Harrison's unit, the one that found our overzealous activities with the railroad construction crews. Such a shame what happened to them." Clara saw Nameless's hands tighten on his rifle, though he didn't raise it. "Nothing to say?" Rusk taunted. "But then, you haven't said anything since that day. Have you? Tell me, do you still dream about them? Your fellow soldiers? Or perhaps you dream about the Cheyenne workers? The rifle swung up so fast, Clara barely saw the movement. For a moment, she thought Nameless would shoot Rusk right there. The railroad men fumbled for their guns, but Nameless's aim never wavered. "No!" Clara found herself crying out. "Please!" Nameless's eyes flicked to her, and something in them softened. Slowly, he lowered the rifle. Then, without breaking eye contact with Rusk, he backed his horse off the trail and let them pass. As the carriage rolled by, Clara turned to look back. Nameless sat motionless on his horse, a figure of dusty vengeance against the red rocks of the canyon. "That man is dangerous," Rusk said, his composure fully restored. "I'll have to do something about him." "If you hurt him," Clara began. "You'll what?" Rusk's voice was silky with threat. "Really, my dear, you seem to have developed an unseemly interest in that savage. I trust it will cease immediately. You are to be my wife, after all." They returned to town in tense silence. That evening, Clara pleaded a headache and retired early. But instead of going to her room, she slipped out the back of the hotel and made her way to the abandoned cabin she'd discovered on one of her walks, a remnant from the town's mining days, forgotten by everyone except, apparently, Nameless. She found him there, sitting on the broken porch, staring out at nothing. He looked up as she approached, and she saw resignation in his eyes, as if he'd known she would come. "Sand Creek," she said without preamble. "I've heard that name. There was a massacre." He nodded once, his face etched with old pain. "But Rusk said railroad workers, not—" She trailed off, understanding beginning to dawn. "There's more to it, isn't there? Something that's been covered up." Nameless stood and walked into the cabin. She followed, finding him kneeling by a loose floorboard. He pried it up and pulled out a leather journal, worn and water-stained. He handed it to her with shaking hands. By the light of a candle, Clara read. The journal belonged to Major William Harrison, and it detailed systematic murders committed by railroad construction crews, not just of Native Americans, but of anyone who stood in the path of expansion. The final entries described Harrison's attempts to report the crimes and the ambush that silenced his unit forever. "You survived," Clara whispered. "You saw it all, and you survived." Nameless touched his throat, and she understood. Whether from injury or trauma, his silence was the price of that survival. And Rusk was part of it. He ordered those killings. A nod. Clara closed the journal, her mind racing. "We have to—" But what could they do? Who would believe the silent testimony of a nameless drifter against a powerful railroad magnate? Nameless took the journal back and returned it to its hiding place. Then he turned to her, and the look in his eyes was so full of longing and sorrow that it took her breath away. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched the spot on her cheek where he'd touched her before. This time, Clara didn't run. She covered his hand with hers, holding it there, feeling the calluses and scars that told their own story of survival. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, though she was. Afraid of Rusk, afraid of her feelings, afraid of the impossible situation closing in around them. He pulled her closer, and she went willingly, letting him wrap his arms around her. They stood there in the candlelight, holding each other like shipwreck survivors clinging to the same piece of driftwood. She could feel his heart beating against hers, wild and strong. When she finally pulled back, there were tears on her cheeks. "I have to marry him," she said. "If I don't, my family will be ruined. My sisters will have no prospects. My mother—" Nameless cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. His eyes asked the question he couldn't voice. "Is that worth your life?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know anything anymore except—" She rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his, a desperate, searching kiss that tasted of tears and dust and forbidden desire. He made a sound deep in his throat, somewhere between pain and pleasure, and kissed her back with a fierce tenderness that made her knees weak. When they broke apart, breathing hard, Clara saw her own wild feelings reflected in his eyes, but she also saw the futility of it all. "I should go," she whispered. He nodded but didn't release her immediately. Instead, he pressed something into her hand, a small leather pouch. Inside was a wedding band, simple and worn. She looked up at him questioningly. He touched the ring, then his heart, then pointed to the photograph she'd seen before, his wife's ring, the only thing of value he owned. And he was giving it to her. "I can't," Clara protested, but he closed her fingers around it. Holding her fist between his palms, his message was clear. "Keep it. Remember." Clara fled the cabin with the ring burning in her palm, knowing that she carried with her not just a token, but a choice between duty and desire, between a life of hollow comfort and one of authentic but dangerous love. The desert wind followed her back to town, whispering of freedom and courage and all the things she feared she didn't possess. The days following their encounter in the cabin were torture for Clara. She moved through the wedding preparations like a sleepwalker, the weight of Nameless's ring hidden on a chain beneath her corset, pressed against her heart. Mrs. Weatherby attributed her distraction to pre-wedding nerves and doubled her efforts to keep Clara busy with fittings and social calls. Meanwhile, disturbing rumors circulated through Dead Horse Gulch. More families along the railroad route reported nighttime visits from masked men. The Millers had sold their land for a fraction of its worth after finding their well poisoned. The Johnsons had fled in the night, leaving everything behind. Clara began her own quiet investigation, driven by a desperate need to find evidence that might stop Rusk legally. She befriended Sarah Chen, whose husband ran the local newspaper, and through careful questions learned that several witnesses to railroad violence had disappeared over the years. She spoke with old-timers in the saloons, buying them drinks with her pin money and listening to their stories of how the railroad had carved its path through blood and threats. "You're that Eastern lady marrying Rusk," one grizzled prospector said, eyeing her suspiciously. "Why you asking all these questions?" "Because I need to know who I'm marrying," Clara replied honestly. The old man leaned in, whiskey strong on his breath. "Then you best stop asking. Miss, folks who ask too many questions about Bartholomew Rusk tend to end up like that fellow used to speak up at town meetings. What was his name? Garrett? No, Grayson. Shot dead in his own home. Robbery, they said, though nothing was took." That evening, Clara found a note slipped under her door. "Meet me at Widow's Rock, midnight, important." It wasn't signed, but she recognized the hand. It was Sarah Chen's. Widow's Rock was a formation outside town, named for a woman who'd thrown herself from it after learning of her husband's death in a mining accident. Clara arrived to find not just Sarah, but a small group of townspeople, the doctor, the school teacher, even Jake Morrison the teamster. "We know what you've been doing," Sarah said, "asking questions, looking for the truth about Rusk." "Are you going to stop me?" Clara asked. "No," Doc Holcomb said. "We want to help. We've been keeping records, gathering evidence, but we needed someone with connections, someone who could get it to the right authorities." They showed her what they'd collected. Testimonies written in secret, photographs of burned homesteads, even financial records showing bribes to local officials. It was damning, but they all knew it wasn't enough. "He's too powerful," the schoolteacher said. "He owns the sheriff, the mayor, half the territorial government. We need a witness who saw the worst of it." someone whose word couldn't be ignored. Clara thought of Major Harrison's journal hidden beneath the floorboards of an abandoned cabin. But that would mean exposing Nameless, putting him in Rusk's crosshairs. "I might know of something," she said carefully. "Give me time." The next day, Rusk announced that the wedding would take place in a week. "I've waited long enough," he told Clara over dinner. "Your father is anxious for news of our union, and I'm eager to have you properly installed as my wife." That night, Clara made a decision. She waited until the town was asleep, then made her way to Nameless's camp. She found him sitting by his fire, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up at her approach, and she saw he'd been expecting her. "I need the journal," she said without preamble. "Major Harrison's journal. There are people ready to act, but they need evidence." He shook his head firmly. "Please, it could stop him. It could save lives." Nameless set aside his whittling and pulled out a piece of charcoal and paper, his method of communication when gestures weren't enough. He wrote, "They all die. Everyone who tries." "Then we die trying," Clara said fiercely. "I can't marry him knowing what he is. I won't." He studied her for a long moment, then wrote, "You could run. My family." He slashed through the words with violent strokes, then wrote, "Your life matters more." "Does it?" Clara challenged. "More than the families he's destroying? More than justice for your fellow soldiers?" That hit home. She saw him flinch, saw the eternal struggle in his eyes between survival and honor. "You were a soldier," she pressed. "You took oaths. Does your silence honor their memory?" He stood abruptly and walked away from the fire. Clara followed, finding him at the edge of the light, his face turned toward the stars. When he finally faced her, she saw he'd made his decision. They rode together through the darkness to the abandoned cabin. Nameless retrieved not just the journal, but a packet of other documents, orders, telegrams, things he'd gathered over the years of drifting, unable to act, but unable to forget. "This is enough," Clara breathed, looking through them. This is more than enough. But when she looked up, Nameless was writing again. "He'll know. He'll come for you. Then we'd better act fast." He caught her arm as she turned to go, his grip urgent. The question in his eyes was clear. "Why are you doing this?" Clara placed her hand over his. "Because it's right. Because someone has to. Because—" She faltered, then spoke the truth. "Because I'd rather die fighting beside you than live in comfort with him." Something broke in his expression then, years of walls crumbling in an instant. He pulled her to him, holding her as if she were the last solid thing in a collapsing world. She could feel him trembling, this man who'd faced death countless times, undone by her simple declaration. When he finally released her, he did something that shocked her. He spoke, or tried to. His mouth moved, shaping a word, though no sound emerged. She watched his lips, understanding. "Clara." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'm here." They were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching fast. Nameless immediately pushed Clara behind him, drawing his gun. But it was Doc Holcomb who burst into the clearing. "Miss Whitmore, thank God I found you. Rusk knows. Someone informed on our meeting. He's arrested Sarah and the others on charges of sedition. He's coming for you next." Clara's mind raced. "The evidence—" "Won't matter if we're all dead or imprisoned," the doctor said grimly. "You need to run. Both of you." But Clara was already forming a different plan. "No, doctor. Take these documents. Ride hard for Fort Benton. Captain James Thornton is stationed there. He's an honest man, a friend of my father's from before the war. Give him everything." "What about you?" Clara lifted her chin. "I'm going back to town. If Rusk wants me, he can have me. But I'll keep him distracted long enough for you to reach the fort." "That's suicide," the doctor protested. Nameless stepped forward, and Clara knew without looking that he was volunteering to go with her. She turned to him, touching his face gently. "No, you're the witness they'll need. When the captain comes, you have to be alive to testify, however you can." He shook his head violently, but she stood firm. This is the only way. You know it is." She removed the chain from around her neck and placed his wife's ring in his palm. "Hold on to this for me, until we meet again." His fingers closed around the ring, his eyes speaking all the words his voice couldn't. "Don't do this. I can't lose you too. I love you." "I know," she whispered. "I love you too." Then she was mounting her horse and riding hard back toward town, toward whatever fate awaited her, leaving behind the only man she'd ever loved and the only life she'd ever wanted. The desert wind carried the echo of hoofbeats and the faint sound that might have been her name shaped by silent lips. A prayer, a promise, a plea to the uncaring stars. Clara arrived back in Dead Horse Gulch as dawn was breaking, her dress dusty and torn from the hard ride. The town was eerily quiet, but she could see Rusk's men positioned at strategic points along the main street. They watched her pass with knowing smirks that made her skin crawl. She found Rusk waiting in the hotel parlor, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. His expression was calm, almost pleasant, but his eyes held a cold fury that made her stomach clench. "My dear Clara," he said, rising smoothly. "What an eventful night you've had. Please, sit. We have much to discuss." "Where are the others?" Clara demanded, remaining standing. "Sarah Chen, the schoolteacher." "Safe, for now." Rusk interrupted. "Their fate depends entirely on you, my dear. You see, I've been very patient with your curiosities, but patience has its limits." He moved closer, and Clara forced herself not to step back. "I know where you've been, who you've been meeting, that savage you seem so fond of. Did you really think I wouldn't have you watched? I don't know what you mean," Clara said evenly. Rusk backhanded her so suddenly she didn't see it coming. The force sent her stumbling against a chair, her cheek burning. "Don't insult my intelligence," he said, his civilized mask finally slipping. "I know about the journal, the evidence your little group gathered. I even know about the good doctor's midnight ride to Fort Benton." He smiled at her shocked expression. "Oh yes, my men caught up with him 10 miles out. Tragic accident. His horse must have spooked and thrown him into that ravine." Clara felt the room spin. "Doc Holcomb. Dead. The evidence lost. Their one chance destroyed. Now," Rusk continued, adjusting his cuffs as if he hadn't just confessed to murder. "We're going to be married tomorrow. Not next week, tomorrow. And you're going to smile and play the blushing bride. Or your friend Sarah will join the doctor in an unfortunate accident. Then the schoolteacher, then anyone else you've corrupted with your Eastern notions of justice." "You're a monster," Clara whispered. "I'm a visionary," Rusk corrected. "And you're going to help me achieve my vision, or watch everyone you care about die, starting with that mute cowboy you're so taken with." Clara's heart stopped. "You said you didn't know where." "I lied. My men have been tracking him since he left you. One word from me, and he's dead. So the question is, my dear, how many people are you willing to sacrifice for your principles?" The next 24 hours passed in a nightmare of preparations. Clara was kept under constant guard, dressed like a doll, and paraded through town. The wedding was to be a grand affair. Rusk had invited every important person in the territory, determined to cement his power with this display. Sarah Chen was brought to help with the preparations, her face bruised but her spirit unbroken. As she pinned Clara's hair, she whispered, "There's still hope. Not everyone is afraid. When the time comes—" "No," Clara breathed back. "No more resistance. I won't have any more blood on my hands." But that night, as Clara stood at her window in her wedding nightgown, she saw a familiar figure in the shadows across the street. Nameless had come back. Her heart soared and broke simultaneously. He was putting himself in terrible danger. A soft scratch at her door made her turn. A piece of paper slid underneath. "Backstairs. Now. Come alone." Clara recognized the hand. It was Jake Morrison, the teamster. Hope flickered. She threw a shawl over her nightgown and crept down the back stairs. Jake waited in the alley with 2 horses. "That fellow of yours made it to Fort Benton," he whispered. Thornton's men found the doc's body and the evidence scattered in the ravine. They pieced together enough. They're coming, but not until tomorrow afternoon. We need to get you out. No, Clara said firmly. If I disappear, Rusk will kill the hostages. I have to go through with the ceremony. Keep him distracted until the soldiers arrive. Jake looked at her with new respect. That's brave, Miss Brave and Foolish. Tell Nameless. She paused, not knowing how to condense everything into a message. Tell him to wait for the soldiers. Tell him to survive. No matter what happens tomorrow, he has to survive to testify. Jake nodded and melted back into the darkness. Clara returned to her room, her mind racing. She had to buy time, had to keep Rusk focused on the wedding until help arrived. The next morning dawned bright and cruel. Clara was dressed in an elaborate white gown that felt like armor made of lace and silk. The church was packed with guests, territorial officials, railroad investors, everyone who mattered in Rusk's world. As she walked down the aisle on the arm of a Rusk associate, her father being conveniently unable to attend, Clara scanned the crowd. She saw the fear in some faces, the greed in others, and there, in the back, standing in the shadows by the door, Nameless. Their eyes met across the crowded church. He was dressed in a borrowed suit that fit him poorly, his hair slicked back, looking uncomfortable but determined. He shouldn't be here. It was too dangerous. But she knew why he'd come. He couldn't let her face this alone. The ceremony began, the Reverend's words washing over Clara like water over stone. She responded mechanically, her entire being focused on drawing out each moment. When the Reverend asked if anyone objected, there was a stir in the congregation. And for a wild moment, Clara thought Nameless would speak, would find his voice at last to save her. But the moment passed in silence. Do you, Clara, take this man? The church doors burst open. Captain James Thornton strode in, flanked by a dozen soldiers, their uniforms dusty from hard riding. Bartholomew Rusk, the captain announced. You are under arrest for murder, extortion, and crimes against the United States government. Chaos erupted. Rusk's men went for their guns, but the soldiers were ready. Gunfire exploded in the church as guests dove for cover. Clara found herself grabbed roughly by Rusk, his arm around her throat. Using her as a shield, "You little witch," he snarled in her ear. "You planned this." He dragged her toward the side door, his gun pressed to her temple. Clara caught a glimpse of Nameless fighting his way through the crowd toward them, his face a mask of desperate fury. They burst out into the graveyard behind the church. Rusk's private carriage waited, the driver holding the horses steady despite the gunfire. But as Rusk forced Clara toward it, a figure stepped out from behind a tombstone. Nameless stood there, no longer the dusty cowboy, but an avenging angel, his gun drawn and steady. Ah, the mute speaks at last. Rusk sneered, tightening his grip on Clara. Drop the gun, or I'll paint these graves with her blood. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen, Clara feeling the cold metal against her temple, Rusk's rapid breathing in her ear, and Nameless's pale eyes fixed on them with terrible intensity. Then Clara did the only thing she could. She went completely limp, dropping her full weight suddenly. Rusk, caught off guard, stumbled. It was only for a second, but it was enough. The gunshot was impossibly loud. Clara felt Rusk's grip loosen, heard him gasp. She rolled away as he fell, clutching his shoulder where Nameless's bullet had found its mark. But Rusk wasn't finished. Even wounded, he raised his gun toward Nameless. Clara screamed a warning, but she was too far away. The second shot came from behind them. Captain Thornton stood at the church door, smoking rifle in hand. Rusk's gun fell from nerveless fingers as he collapsed, a red stain spreading across his white shirt. "No," Rusk gasped, his eyes finding Clara. You were mine, bought and paid for. I was never yours," Clara said quietly. "I was never anyone's to buy." Rusk's eyes went dark, and the most powerful man in the territory died in a graveyard, surrounded by the monuments to other men's ambitions. Clara felt strong arms wrap around her, and she turned to bury her face in Nameless's chest. She could feel him shaking, could hear the broken sounds he made. Not quite words, but close. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." Captain Thornton approached, his expression grim but kind. "Miss Whitmore, I'll need your testimony. And yours as well." He addressed Nameless. "I understand you were a witness to the Sand Creek murders?" Nameless nodded, his arms still tight around Clara. "Can you write your testimony?" Another nod. "Good. Justice has been a long time coming for those victims." The captain touched his hat. "Take your time. My men will secure the town." As the soldiers rounded up Rusk's associates, Clara and Nameless stood in the graveyard, holding each other among the weathered stones. The wedding dress was torn and stained with dirt and blood, a fitting end to a union that should never have been. "I thought I'd lost you," Clara said, looking up at him. "When Jake said you'd gone to Fort Benton." Nameless touched her face gently, his thumb tracing the bruise Rusk had left. His lips moved carefully. "Never." It was barely a whisper, rough from disuse, but it was the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. The aftermath of Rusk's death sent ripples through the territory like a stone thrown into still water. Within days, officials arrived from Helena to investigate the depth of corruption. What they found shocked even the most cynical among them: bribes reaching into the highest levels of government, a trail of bodies hidden as accidents, and systematic theft of land through terror and intimidation. Clara spent her days giving testimony, her nights in the small cabin at the edge of town that she'd rented after leaving the hotel. She couldn't bear to stay in the place where Rusk had held her prisoner in all but name. Nameless had returned to his lean-to, but he was never far away, a silent guardian in the shadows. The investigation revealed more than anyone had anticipated. Among Rusk's private papers, they found correspondence implicating a network of corrupt railroad barons across the West. The scandal reached newspapers in Chicago and New York. Clara received a telegram from her father, a mixture of relief at her safety and horror at what she'd endured. He offered to send money for her immediate return to Boston. She stared at the telegram for a long time, sitting on the porch of her cabin as the sun set over the desert. Going home would be the sensible thing. She could return to her old life, perhaps find a suitable husband who didn't murder people for profit. Her family's debts had been mysteriously cleared. Captain Thornton hinted that recovered assets from Rusk's crimes had been discreetly directed to victims, including her father. "You're thinking of leaving?" The rough whisper made her look up. Nameless stood at the foot of her porch, hat in hand. His voice was still uncertain, words coming with visible effort, but each day brought more speech as years of silence slowly broke. "My father wants me to come home," Clara admitted. "He says I've been through enough, that I should return to where it's safe, civilized. Is that what you want?" Clara studied him, this man who'd saved her life, who'd found his voice again partly through loving her. "What I want seems impossible." He climbed the steps slowly, sitting beside her on the worn boards. "Why? Because what I want is a life here, in this wild place that tried to kill me. What I want is to wake up to desert sunrises and go to sleep under stars so bright they hurt. What I want," she turned to face him, "is you, but I don't even know your real name." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, haltingly, Daniel McKenna." "Daniel," she repeated softly, tasting the name. "It suits you." "I stopped being him after Sand Creek. After Mary and—" His voice broke. Clara took his hand. "Your wife and child." He nodded. "Fever took them. While I was away playing soldier, came back to empty graves. Then the massacre, the cover-up. Lost my voice the day they ambushed my unit. Doc said it was trauma, mind protecting itself. And now, he squeezed her hand. "I have reasons to speak again." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. "Finally," Clara said, "I received another letter today, from Sarah Chen. She and the others who were arrested have been cleared of all charges. The town council wants to give me a commendation for my role in exposing Rusk. Daniel made a sound that might have been a laugh. You deserve it. I don't want commendations. I want... She paused, gathering courage. I want to build something real here. The Hendricks are rebuilding their ranch. They'll need help. Sarah's talking about starting a school for all children, not just those who can afford it. This town could become something better than what Rusk tried to make it. That's a fine dream, Daniel said carefully. It's only a dream if I'm dreaming it alone. He turned to her then, and in the lamplight from her window, she could see the struggle in his face, hope warring with fear, desire with doubt. Clara, I'm nobody, just a broken-down soldier with too many ghosts. You could have anyone. She silenced him with a kiss, soft but certain. I don't want anyone. I want the man who rode out of the desert to save me. I want the man who gave me his wife's ring to keep me strong. I want the man who faced down Rusk knowing it might cost him everything. I want you, Daniel McKenna, ghosts and all. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. Stay, he whispered. Stay with me. Yes, she breathed against his neck. Yes. The next weeks passed in a blur of change. The investigation concluded with dozens of arrests across the territory. Clara used part of her small inheritance to buy a piece of land outside town. Nothing grand, just enough for a small horse ranch. Daniel moved his few possessions from the lean-to to the old homestead cabin on the property. They worked side by side in the desert sun, repairing fences, breaking horses, building a life from scratch. Clara learned to shoot, to ride like a Western woman, to doctor horses and mend harnesses. Her hands grew calloused, her skin brown from the sun. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the pale Boston lady who'd arrived in Dead Horse Gulch just months before. Daniel's voice grew stronger with use. He would never be a chatterer, but he could hold conversations now, even laugh occasionally. A rusty sound that made Clara's heart soar. At night, they would sit on their porch, planning improvements to the ranch, discussing the changes in town as it slowly healed from Rusk's reign of terror. One evening, as they watched thunderclouds build over the mountains, Daniel cleared his throat. Clara, I have something to ask. She turned to find him holding the worn wedding band she'd returned to him, his first wife's ring. I know it's not much, he said, his voice rough with emotion. And I know you deserve better than a dusty ranch and a man with more past than future. But I love you more than I thought I could love anyone again. Will you? Yes, Clara interrupted, laughing through sudden tears. Yes, Daniel. Yes to the dusty ranch and the man with a past and the future we'll build together. Yes to all of it. He slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all along for her. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Sarah Chen stood as Clara's witness, Jake Morrison as Daniel's. The reverend who'd almost married her to Rusk performed the service with considerably more joy this time. Half the town turned out, bringing food and gifts, celebrating not just a wedding but the symbol of new beginnings it represented. As the sun set on her wedding day, her real wedding day, Clara stood with her husband on the rise overlooking their land. Dead Horse Gulch spread out below them, the lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dark. Do you ever regret it? Daniel asked. Giving up Boston? Your family's expectations? Everything you were raised for? Clara leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the rightness of this life they'd chosen. I wasn't raised for that life, she said. I was raised for this one. It just took me a while to find it. He kissed the top of her head, and I found my voice again. We found each other, Clara corrected. Everything else followed from that. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall, a blessing in the drought-prone land. They stood together, letting the rain wash over them, clean and new as their life together. In the morning, there would be work, horses to train, fences to mend, a ranch to run. There would be challenges too. Clara knew. Not everyone in the territory was happy about Rusk's fall, and there would always be those who resented a woman who'd chosen her own path over society's expectations. But tonight, there was just this, the two of them, the rain, and the vast western sky stretching endlessly before them. Clara closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of sage and rain and freedom, knowing that she was exactly where she belonged. She'd been promised to a railroad tycoon, but she'd chosen the dust-covered cowboy with no name, and in choosing him, she'd finally chosen herself. 3 years had passed since Clara and Daniel's wedding, and their small ranch had prospered beyond their modest dreams. The territory of Montana had achieved statehood, bringing new laws and a sense of order that made the bad old days seem like a half-remembered nightmare. But some nightmares had a way of returning. Clara was in the barn, tending to a mare about to foal, when she heard the dogs barking, not their usual greeting, but the aggressive sound reserved for strangers. She grabbed the rifle they kept by the door and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. 3 riders approached along the dusty road. Even from a distance, something about them set her nerves on edge. They wore city clothes, but they sat their horses like men accustomed to long rides and quick getaways. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Clara called out, the rifle resting easy in her arms. Not quite threatening, but ready. The lead rider, a thin man with cold gray eyes, touched his hat. "Mrs. McKenna, I presume. We're looking for your husband. He's out on the range." Clara lied smoothly. Daniel was actually in town, helping to raise a new schoolhouse. "What's your business with him?" "Old business," the man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Samuel Frost. I represent certain Eastern interests who were associates of the late Bartholomew Rusk." Clara's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression neutral. "Rusk is dead. His crimes exposed. Any business he had died with him?" "Not all of it," Frost disagreed. "Your husband possesses certain knowledge that could be problematic for important people. We're here to make him a generous offer for his continued silence. My husband already gave his testimony. The matter is closed." Frost's smile widened. "Is it? You see, Mrs. McKenna, Rusk was merely one tentacle of a much larger organism. There are men in Washington, New York, San Francisco, men whose names you'd recognize, who would prefer certain details about the railroad expansion remain buried." "Get off our land," Clara said, raising the rifle slightly. Now, Frost said, his hand moving casually toward his coat. "No need for unpleasantness. We're prepared to offer you $50,000, enough to expand this little ranch into an empire. All your husband has to do is sign a document stating his previous testimony was coerced, that he has no actual knowledge of any wrongdoing beyond what Rusk personally orchestrated." "I said get off our land." Frost's eyes hardened. "Consider carefully. Mrs. McKenna, we're offering carrots today. Tomorrow, we might bring sticks." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made all 4 of them turn. Daniel came thundering up the road, and Clara saw he wasn't alone. Jake Morrison and several other men from town rode with him. Someone must have seen the strangers and raised an alarm. Daniel swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped, positioning himself between Clara and the visitors. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady and clear, still a wonder to Clara even after 3 years. "I believe my wife asked you to leave." Frost studied Daniel with interest. "Ah, the famous mute who found his voice. How poetic. I was just explaining to your charming wife that we have a business proposition." "I heard about your proposition in town," Daniel interrupted. "You stopped at the saloon first, trying to gather information. Big mistake in a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business. Then you know we're offering you a fortune for a simple signature. I know you're offering blood money to buy lies." Daniel's hand rested on his gun. "My testimony stands, every word of it." Frost's companions shifted restlessly, hands moving toward weapons. But Jake and the townsmen were ready, rifles visible and steady. "This is a mistake, McKenna," Frost warned. "The men I represent don't accept refusal well." "Then they'll have to learn," Daniel said simply. "This isn't 1883 anymore. Montana is a state now, with the laws and decent people ready to enforce them. Your boss's reach isn't as long as they think." Frost's mask of civility finally cracked. "You have no idea who you're defying. They have resources you can't imagine, connections everywhere, and yet they sent you here to threaten a rancher and his wife." Clara interjected. "That doesn't speak of unlimited power, it speaks of desperation." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke before a lightning strike. Then Frost gathered his reins. "This isn't over," he promised. "One way or another, we'll get what we came for. The only thing you'll get is a cold trail out of town." Jake Morrison spoke up. "And I'd ride fast if I were you. Word's already spreading about your visit. Folks around here have long memories about what happened to those who stood with Rusk." Frost and his men wheeled their horses and rode away, dust clouds marking their retreat. But Clara knew this wasn't a victory. It was merely the opening move in a new game. That night, Clara and Daniel sat at their kitchen table with Jake and several other trusted friends, planning for what they all knew was coming. "They'll be back," Jake said bluntly. "Men like that don't give up easy." "I know," Daniel replied, "but I won't lie, not for any amount of money. Those soldiers at Sand Creek, the workers Rusk murdered, they deserve justice, even if it's incomplete." Sarah Chen, now the town's schoolteacher and unofficial chronicler of its history, leaned forward. "What if we turn this around? Use their threat against them?" "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "They're afraid of what Daniel knows, what might still come to light. What if we make that fear real? I've been corresponding with journalists in the East, people interested in the full story of the railroad corruption. If we could get Daniel's complete testimony published, not just what came out in the trial, but everything, it would paint targets on all our backs," Jake warned. "We already have targets on our backs," Clara pointed out. "At least this way, we'd be shooting back." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "Do it. I'll write down everything I remember, every name, every date. If they want a war, we'll give them one they can't win with bullets." Over the next weeks, Daniel worked with Sarah to document his memories while Clara turned their ranch into a fortress. She hired extra hands, men who could work cattle but also handle guns. She ordered supplies laid in as if preparing for a siege. The mare foaled successfully, and Clara named the colt Justice. It seemed appropriate. The second visit came on a moonless night. Clara woke to the sound of horses moving carefully in the darkness. She nudged Daniel awake, and they moved according to the plan they'd rehearsed. Clara took position at the bedroom window with the rifle while Daniel slipped out the back. Fire arrows began arcing through the night, aimed at their barn, the same tactic Rusk had used years ago. But they were ready. Buckets of water and sand waited at strategic points, and their hired hands emerged from concealed positions to fight the flames. Gunfire erupted as Frost's men realized their surprise was blown. Clara picked her targets carefully, aiming to wound rather than kill. She saw Daniel moving through the shadows like the ghost he'd once been, turning the hunters into the hunted. The battle was brief but vicious. When it ended, 2 of Frost's men lay dead, 3 others wounded and captured. Frost himself had fled into the night, leaving his men behind, the mark of a coward and a poor leader. Sheriff William Tanner, Jake Morrison's son-in-law and an honest lawman, arrived with deputies as the sun rose. He surveyed the damage, the partially burned barn, the bodies, the captured men. "Self-defense, clear as day," he declared. "These men attacked your property with intent to kill. You had every right to defend yourselves." But Clara knew this wasn't over. Frost was still out there, and the men he represented wouldn't give up easily. She found Daniel standing by the corral, watching their horses nervously circle after the night's excitement. "You all right?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "Been better," he admitted. "Thought I was done with killing. You were protecting our home, our life." He pulled her close. "I know. Doesn't make it easier." He paused, then added, "Sarah sent word. The first article publishes tomorrow in the New York Tribune. After that, there's no going back." "There never was," Clara said firmly. "From the moment we stood up to Rusk, we chose this path. The only way out is through." 2 days later, the newspaper story exploded across the nation. The butchers of the rails A survivor's account of murder and corruption in the Western expansion ran on front pages from New York to San Francisco. Daniel's testimony, complete and unvarnished, named names and connected dots that prosecutors had missed or been pressured to ignore. The response was immediate. Telegraph messages poured in, some offering support, others making threats. Government investigators announced they were reopening closed cases. Several prominent businessmen suddenly found urgent reasons to travel abroad. And in Dead Horse Gulch, the community closed ranks around Clara and Daniel. When Frost returned with a larger force, he found not just a single ranch to attack, but an entire town ready to fight. The showdown everyone expected never came, faced with organized resistance and national scrutiny. Frost's employers apparently decided to cut their losses. Frost himself was found dead in a Denver hotel room a month later, killed by persons unknown. The cynical said his employers had eliminated a liability. The romantic preferred to think justice had found its own way. Standing on their porch as autumn painted the mountains gold, Clara and Daniel watched riders approach, but these wore the badges of federal marshals, coming to take additional testimony for the new investigations. "Think it's really over this time?" Clara asked. Daniel squeezed her hand. "This part, maybe. There'll always be men like Rusk and Frost, but now people know we'll fight back. That changes things." Clara thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a dusty stagecoach robbery to this moment of tentative triumph, the cost had been high, paid in blood and fear, and long nights wondering if they'd see another dawn. But they'd built something worth fighting for, not just a ranch or a marriage, but a community that stood against the darkness. "No regrets?" Daniel asked, echoing his question from their wedding day. Clara smiled, thinking of the strong man beside her who'd found his voice, the ranch that had become a symbol of resistance, the town that had chosen justice over easy corruption. "Not one," she said, and meant it. 5 more years had passed since the night of fire and bullets. The McKenna Ranch had grown into one of the most respected horse operations in Montana, known for producing mounts with both spirit and steadiness. Clara stood in the main corral, working with a young stallion, her movements confident and sure. The years had etched fine lines around her eyes and streaked her dark hair with premature silver, but she wore them proudly, badges of survival and strength. "Easy, boy," she murmured to the nervous horse. "That's it. You're safe here." From the porch of their expanded house, Daniel watched his wife work her magic. His own hair had gone completely gray. The weight of memories did that to a man, but his eyes were clear and peaceful, in a way they hadn't been when they'd first met. Beside him sat a small girl of about 4 years, with Clara's dark hair and his pale blue eyes. "Mama's good with horses," little Mary said solemnly. "The best," Daniel agreed, ruffling his daughter's hair. They'd named her after his first wife, with Clara's blessing. A bridge between past and present, loss and renewal. A rider approached along the main road, and Daniel tensed from old habit before recognizing Sarah Chen's distinctive posture in the saddle. She'd married the new newspaper editor 2 years back and ran the most successful school in 3 counties, but she still made time to visit regularly. "Afternoon, Daniel," she called, dismounting with practiced ease. Clara breaking another wild one? Just introducing him to the idea of partnership. Daniel replied, "Coffee's hot if you want some." Sarah accepted gratefully, bouncing Mary on her knee while Daniel poured. "I bring news from town. Remember that federal investigation into the railroad corruption?" Daniel's expression darkened slightly. Even after all these years, the memories could still bite. "What about it?" Final verdicts came down. 17 convictions, including 2 senators and a federal judge. The prosecutor cited your testimony as crucial to breaking the whole thing wide open. Sarah smiled. "You did it, Daniel. You got justice for all those who couldn't speak for themselves." Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching Clara in the corral. "Partial justice," he said finally. "Can't bring back the dead. Can't undo what was done." "No," Sarah agreed. "But you prevented it from continuing. That counts for something." Mary squirmed down from Sarah's lap and ran toward the corral, calling, "Mama! Mama!" Clara handed the horse's lead to one of their hands and scooped up her daughter, spinning her around until she squealed with laughter. "She's the image of Clara at that age," Sarah observed. "I remember when Clara first arrived in Dead Horse Gulch, that terrified Eastern lady in her ruined silk dress. Look at her now." "She saved me," Daniel said simply. "In every way a person can be saved." That evening, they held one of their regular gatherings, a tradition that had started in the dark days after Frost's attacks and evolved into something more celebratory. Jake Morrison arrived with his family, the Hendricks, whose ranch had recovered and thrived, and dozens of others who'd stood together in the bad times as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Clara found herself standing apart for a moment, watching the scene. Children played in the yard while adults shared stories and laughter. The ghosts of violence and fear seemed very far away. Daniel appeared at her elbow, slipping his arm around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts? Just remembering?" Clara said, "That scared girl who climbed off the stagecoach all those years ago, if someone had told her she'd end up here, she might have run back to Boston." Clara laughed. "Maybe, but I'm glad she didn't. Even with everything, the danger, the fights, the times we nearly lost everything." Clara turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd been nameless when she'd met him, who'd found his voice partly through loving her. "Especially with everything, we earned this life. Daniel, every sunrise, every peaceful night, every moment of joy, we paid for them in full." Mary ran up, tugging at Clara's skirts. "Story, Mama, story about how you met Papa." It had become a favorite bedtime tale, carefully edited for young ears. Clara lifted her daughter while Daniel lit the lanterns that would keep the gathering going well into the night. "Well," Clara began, settling Mary on her hip, "once upon a time, a very foolish girl from a faraway city came to a wild town in Montana." "Dead Horse Gulch," Mary supplied happily. "That's right. And on the way, bad men tried to hurt her. But then, out of the desert came a mysterious cowboy." As Clara told the story, she caught Daniel's eye. He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his weathered face. Other children gathered around to listen, and soon Clara had an audience of a dozen little ones, all wide-eyed at the tale of adventure and romance. But the real story, Clara thought, was in the afterward. Not the dramatic rescue or the villain's defeat, but this, the quiet building of a life, day by day, year by year. The way Daniel had slowly reclaimed his voice and his name. The way she'd transformed from a sheltered Eastern lady into a woman of the West. The way they'd taken their scars and made them into foundations for something beautiful. "And they lived happily ever after?" Mary asked sleepily as the story wound down. Clara looked around at their friends and neighbors, at the ranch they'd built with their own hands, at the man who'd given up his silence for her. Not a fairy tale ending, but something better, real and earned and true. "They lived," she said softly, kissing her daughter's head. "They lived with courage and love and hope, and that, my darling, is the happiest ending of all." Later, after the guests had gone and Mary was asleep, Clara and Daniel sat on their porch as they did every evening, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The night wind carried the scent of sage and the distant howl of coyotes, wild sounds that had once frightened Clara but now meant home. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd actually married Rusk?" Clara asked idly. Daniel pulled her closer. "You wouldn't have, even if I hadn't been there. You'd have found a way to fight. It's who you are." "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I got a letter from my father today. He's finally coming to visit. Says he wants to meet the man who tamed his wild daughter." Daniel chuckled. "Tamed? He's going to be disappointed." "Good," Clara said fiercely. "I was never meant to be tame." They sat in comfortable silence. Two survivors who'd found each other in the harsh beauty of the frontier. Inside, their daughter slept peacefully, dreaming perhaps of heroic cowboys and brave ladies. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, horses to train, a ranch to run, a life to live. But tonight, there was just this perfect moment of peace. Clara thought back to that day on the trail when she'd first seen Daniel, nameless then, covered in dust, appearing like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. She'd been promised to a railroad tycoon, bound by duty and family obligation to a life that would have crushed her spirit. Instead, she'd chosen the silent cowboy with the haunted eyes. And in choosing him, she'd chosen herself. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal and unchanging, while below them the land they'd fought for stretched out in all directions. Somewhere in the darkness, a screech owl called, and its mate answered. Wild voices in the night. Free and unfettered. No regrets? Daniel asked. Their old ritual? Never, Clara answered, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Not one single regret. And in the vast silence of the Montana night, with her daughter safe in bed and her husband's arms around her, Clara McKenna, who had once been Clara Whitmore of Boston, knew that she had found her true home at last, not in a place or a position, but in the choice to write her own story, to fight for her own happiness, and to love without reservation or retreat. She had been promised to a railroad tycoon, but she had chosen the dust-covered cowboy with no name. And that choice had made all the difference. Thank you so much for listening to this tale of love and courage in the Old West. If you're enjoying these stories around our Wild West Campfire, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just like the old telegraph lines that once linked our frontier towns. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of romance and adventure from the American frontier. And please share your thoughts about Clara and Daniel's journey. Did their story touch your heart? What part moved you the most? Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own sunset. And remember, sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in gold mines, but in the choices we make and the people we choose to stand beside. Happy trails!